Hello, my name is Andrew Keene. Welcome to Keene on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. It's Wednesday, July the 8th, 2026. My guest today, very distinguished political consultant on the left of the Democratic Party, Thomas A. Devine, otherwise known as Tad. He's been involved with all sorts of interesting campaigns, including Al Gore's 2000 and John Kerry's 2004 presidential campaigns. And he was also the chief strategist for Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential campaign, a campaign that ended in failure but made a lot of news. And Tad has a new book out. It came out yesterday about that campaign. It's called How the Democrats Screwed Bernie. Tad is joining us from New York, where he's celebrating not the birth of a grandchild, another grandchild, Tad, but the birth of your new book. I'm curious, before we get to the new book, what was writing a book like in comparison to running a campaign? Is it similar?
No, it was a very different and unique experience. I had never written an entire book before. I had written chapters in books, and they were college academic books, you know, about media consulting and things that I do and campaigns. But this was a whole different process, and very different from campaigns, which is so collegial. You're with people all the time. You're out and about. This was more an isolated event. I collaborated with others. My editor at Simon & Schuster, Ian Strauss. I had a writer who worked with me and really helped me, an agent who brought her in to help me to organize things and get it together. But it was a much more solitary experience than the work that I'm used to, which is to write, direct, and produce television advertising for campaigns.
The title of the book suggests, Tad, a degree of anger, how the Democrats screwed Bernie. Is it an angry book? Did you need to get this off your chest?
You know, I hope it's not an angry book, but I think it does express a degree of anger. That title came about not because I felt like I wanted that to be the title. As a matter of fact, we came up with a lot of titles, a little group of people who were working together collaboratively to produce this book in a very short time frame. It was actually the idea of the then editor of Simon & Schuster for that title. I submitted many titles, as did others who were in our loop, and none of them seemed to live up to what we were trying to do with the book. And at first, when I said, no, I don't think it will be a good book, I said, because it sounds too much like Trump. And I just don't want to be anything like him. But as I went through the process of considering all of these other titles, and also as I went through the process of beginning to write the book, I realized that it most accurately expressed how I felt about what happened in 2016. I don't want it to be viewed so much as an angry missive to the past. I want it to be something of a learning experience so that we can look back and find out the mistakes that were made, rectify those mistakes, and maybe win more elections if we do.
Yeah, the book also the title of the book is also interesting because, of course, you don't need to mention Sanders. Everybody knows who Bernie is, but before, nobody really knew who he was. Tell me about your relationship with Bernie Sanders. How did you come across him? I'm not suggesting that you were part of the Democratic establishment, but you did work on Gore and Kerry's presidential campaigns. Both were relatively centrist candidates. So how did you come across Bernie? And did you change your mind of him over the years? I mean, he was always outside the party. Some people thought him as he defined himself obviously as a socialist or a democratic socialist. So tell me your history of your sure. Bernie history, Tad.
Well, first, I would have to plead guilty to being very much a part of the Democratic establishment, earlier in my career. As a matter of fact, one time, believe it or not, Bernie said to me, Tad, you're my link to the establishment. And I replied to him, Bernie, you're a United States Senator. That is the establishment, okay? But I first met
And you
Bernie,
were probably both right.
Yeah, I know. In a funny way, yes. I first met Bernie in 1996. he had almost lost re-election to the House of Representatives in 1994. Remember, that was a terrible year for Democrats. And while he was an independent, he was caucusing with the Democrats, and he was almost dragged down by what was happening all across the country when the Republicans took over the Congress for the first time in 40 years in 1994. One of his colleagues, Peter DeFazio, who was also a member of the Progressive Caucus, a congressman for Oregon, my partner, Mike Donilon, who went on to become Joe Biden's top strategist in the White House, and I worked on Peter's campaign. And we did, I think, a really good job. We came in about a month before the election. We made a whole new series of ads, and he was 30 points behind at the time. He wound up losing by just a couple of points. And mostly he lost because most of the votes got cast before any of the advertising hit. That was the first time they had an all mail-in ballot election in America, an Oregon special election. And, Peter was close to Bernie, and he said, listen, I think you should talk to these guys. They really helped me. I think we would have won the campaign if it hadn't been for, all the early votes before the advertising hit. And so I was summoned, to Bernie's office. Mike and I went over there.
What year was that?
That was the beginning of 1996. So 20 years before the presidential campaign. And, Mike and I sat down. I said, yeah, my first question to Bernie was, you're a socialist. And he said, no, a democratic socialist. That distinction was very important to him. And anyway, I wound up being the guy who handled the campaign. Bernie won the race by 26 points instead of barely squeaking through. I think, his impression of what the so-called, Washington consultants were, which I represented, improved, at least as it pertained to me. And then 10 years later, when he ran for the United States Senate, he asked me to work for him again. This time we were up against a billionaire who spent $7.5 million in Vermont. So the equivalent of spending $7.5 million in Vermont on a Senate race would be spending $350 million in California. Okay, it was a massive amount of money, and we beat him. His name was Rich Tarrant, by 30 points as well. And so I had this history with Bernie of first getting to know him in the House race, working for him, a lot of success, a big win. The 10 years later, a big win in the Senate race. And so I stayed in touch with him. And honestly, we became friends. I mean, I think Bernie and I were very friendly through the years and spent a lot of time, talking to each other at, dinners and lunches and things like that when I would get together with him. And so when he approached me later, now going into the end of 2014, before 2015, and told me that he was thinking about running for president of the United States, I was frankly shocked. I mean, I just couldn't, I didn't see it. I didn't really think of him as someone who would make that kind of run. But as we got into it and we talked about it and, I worked my way through it, I began to see the light that he had the real possibility perhaps of, succeeding in that arena. And that led to my involvement in his 2016 presidential campaign.
A lot happened, of course, between 1996 when you first met Bernie and 2014 when you had that conversation about him running for president, particularly, I guess, the Great Recession of 2008 and 9. Who changed more, Tad, over those almost 20 years? Was it you or Bernie?
Well, it was definitely me, because Bernie has not changed a bit in all the time I've known him. And if you look back even further, before I came on the scene in 1996, he was saying the things he's saying now, 10 and 20 years before that. He's always had a constant focus on the problems of America, that its economy has been rigged. And most recently, in the wake of Citizens United, it has been rigged by a corrupt system of campaign finance. He understood the way that the power centers worked in the country and how that was oppressing working people and taking away from their opportunity to earn a good and decent living. So Bernie really hasn't changed at all. I mean, and it's amazing sometimes. It's not just his ideas and the way he expresses himself. I've got a picture of us at that shoot in 1996. Okay, so that's a long time ago, 30 years ago. He looked exactly the same in that shoot picture.
I know, it's incredible. I mean, I guess he was probably, he looks as if he was born with glasses and gray hair, was he?
Well, he really, there's a little less hair, but he's the same weight. He's the same demeanor. He sounds the same. He has the same level of energy. I mean, it's an unbelievable thing. I was much thinner, I was a younger guy, but it is amazing to me that he has been so consistent in his beliefs and the way he expresses them, and also, frankly, in his physical appearance and demeanor. I think if Joe Biden were as vital as Bernie, he would have served a second term as president.
Well, certainly even close to being vital. Do you think one of the reasons, Tad, that Bernie hasn't changed is because, as you say, he's never compromised. He's taken a position. He's held it for 30, 40, 50 years. He has a critique of American democracy and American capitalism. And the events have changed around him, but he hasn't changed. He hasn't compromised his position. He hasn't had to tell lies. I mean, the closest thing to a political consultant that he's worked with is yourself. So is that one reason why he seems in such remarkably good health and remains so, in his own way, youthful?
I think, but I also think it's a little more complicated when we say he's never compromised. I believe he has never compromised his values, his stance on the big frame of politics. And yet he was a very effective legislator. And you cannot be effective as a legislator without compromising, if you're going to have a two-party system. And there was a period of time when he was in the House of Representatives over the course of a decade that he passed more pieces of legislation than any member of Congress in either party. Okay, he did that because he worked principally with Republicans to get it done. And when he was a senator and they had the crisis of of healthcare at the VA, he and John McCain locked themselves in the room for about 3 days and came out with the most important and significant piece of legislation in that session of Congress, which the two of them negotiated together. So Bernie has not compromised, I think, on that basic level of what he believes and what he stands for and who he fights for. But he has the capacity, certainly as a legislator, and I think he would have as president as well, to reach compromised solutions with others, even people who have very different views than him on some big issues.
So, as we've said several times, the new book, it's out. It was out yesterday. How the Democrats Screwed Bernie is rather generic. Of course, when we think about the Democrats in 2016, we think of Hillary Clinton. Is that in the title of the book, Tad? Is the Democrats a euphemism for the Clintons or Hillary?
Not entirely. When I say the Democrats, I'm talking about three distinct sort of power centers. Number one is Hillary Clinton and her campaign. I would say the Clinton campaign, and I would, include both the president and Hillary in that regard. Number two is the Democratic National Committee, which was supposed to be a neutral body that oversaw the nominating process. It turned out to be not a neutral body at all, but a wholly owned subsidiary of the Clinton campaign. And number three was the Democratic establishment. Its leaders like Harry Reid, for example, or Chuck Schumer. It's leadership in the House as well. It's leadership around the country. When I say the Democrats, that's who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the establishment, the party, and the Clinton campaign.
Do you think, Tad, if Donald Trump had got knocked over by a New York bus or decided that he didn't want to run for president or got put in jail or something, there would be a need for this kind of book? I mean, had Hillary won, had you not had the Trump phenomenon, this whole issue of the Democrats and Bernie wouldn't seem so absurd now. In fact, the centrist establishment, who, as you said, whether they screwed them or organized themselves politically to effectively bar Bernie from being the candidate, that it wouldn't be as pertinent or as sensitive. Because, I mean, I know that Bernie and Trump have a peculiar kind of almost like a symbiotic relationship, but they're separate political phenomenon, although they kind of coexist in parallel, I guess.
Yeah, I think calling it a parallel relationship, I think, is even better than symbiotic. But if Hillary had won, I don't think there would have been a need for the book. If there was no Trump, there would have been less of a need for the book. If we had not had what happened in 2024 with the way that process was conducted, there really would not have been a need for the book. But in light of all the circumstances that have happened, I mean, one of the reasons as I got into writing it and really realized what I was thinking about and trying to capture, I realized that, I was trying to look to the past for pertinent lessons for today and tomorrow, not a history of what happened, and I think what happened in 2016 was that the country, the voters, were demanding change. And the democratic process produced a candidate who could not meet the expectations of the voters. They did in 2008 with Obama, which was also a change election, but they did not 8 years later. And what I wanted the party to do is to look at its process of nominating a candidate for president and stop trying to rig it. Stop trying to give so much power to insiders and institutions that the voice of the voters is muted. Because if we want to win elections, we're going to have to take the lead from them and not force a candidate upon them.
Is one of the problems with candidates like Clinton, and Harris also comes to mind, is that the establishment of the Democratic Party thinks of itself as the change party, as the party of the left, of American progressivism, but actually is the party of a coastal elite. Again, Hillary is a good example, and I think Kamala Harris an even better example, is that in very simple terms, they don't reflect reality.
Well, listen, I think the Democratic Party, aspires to be, a party that is a big tent and brings in people all across America, but we haven't attained that. Unfortunately, I think the power centers of the party are in tow of a system which is corrupt at its nature. And the system I'm referring to is the system of campaign finance. And as long as the Democratic Party persists within that system and tries to be a part of it as much or even more at times than the Republicans, we will be a victim of it. That is my view, my personal view. And we have to break away from this system because it is the system of campaign finance in America, a corrupt system, which is destroying our economy in fundamental ways and also destroying our politics. So that's what the problem is, I think, with the Democratic Party. Not necessarily.
Is it Bernie? Bernie, that was a Freudian error, Tad. Is it a catch-22? The only way you can run is by getting large political contributions. So it's hard to run with all those political contributions and then run against the very financial system that enabled those contributions.
It is, and I'm a realist, and I'm not an ideologue. I'm not out here expressing my philosophy or ideology. I want the book to exist within the world that I live in, which is the world of trying to win elections. And I recognize, that when one side has mountains of money and the other side has a little pool of money to the side, okay, that is not a fair fight. But there are ways to deal with that. And let me give you a real world example. New York City, where I am today, has a mayor, who won a surprising election. Mayor Mandami got elected against all of the odds, all of the polls. How did he do it? Well, he did it first by having a winning message that connected with voters, by organizing a campaign that could mobilize support, by bringing new people into the process. But he also did it, in my view, it's my personal view, because New York City has a very generous system of campaign public finance. I think it's a 5-to-1 match, okay, where you raise $1, you get 5. And he was able to, on the basis of the public funding scheme in New York, raise enough money to actually communicate with people through the means that I believe is still the most important one. And I'm biased in that because I make television ads, but television advertising is still sort of the big kahuna in this thing. And Mandami was able to come in and have a floor level of communication through television advertising that allowed people to hear his message in a meaningful way. And on top of that, put all the organization and the other aspects of campaigning that made the difference in his victory. So I think we can compete with the Republicans in some places, if we can begin to build a system where campaign finance exists, at least for us to compete. Sure, he was outspent massively by the super PACs and the Wall Street interests on his opponent's side that tried to elect Cuomo. But it was not enough for them to stop him. So that's what we've got to do in the meantime. We have to get away from dark money. When I talk about dark money, I'm talking about the money that comes into campaigns that has no public disclosure. It secretly snuck in through the back door. That's a first step. We need to have more public financing, particularly at the local levels, so we can give new candidates an opportunity to come in and compete against the old money that still dominates Democratic politics as well as Republican politics.
And returning back to that 2016 primary election that you cover in the new book, How the Democrats Screwed Bernie. How did Bernie raise the money? Was it by small contributions? Did he go to the unions? Did he go to the banks? Did he go to Silicon Valley billionaires?
He did not. And that's another lesson from this book. Bernie Sanders in 2016 raised $250 million in small dollar contributions. His average contribution was $27 a contribution. He did so by reaching out and appealing to people and developing a system of fundraising, principally, through email solicitation, that allowed him to raise that amount of money. He actually wound up, outspending Hillary in much of the primary period, if we just look campaign to campaign. Now, of course, she had super PACs on her side supporting her, and she was benefiting from that support, even in the primary process. But Bernie Sanders established the model of how you can raise money outside the massive fundraising of super PACs. I don't even remember a fundraiser in our campaign. There may have been one that I missed or something, but it was really not that kind of a campaign. And Bernie's not the kind of guy who's going to go hobnob with billionaires when he's attacking them. Okay, his message is no good with the audience, number one, and number two, he just would never do it. But we found a way to reach out to people, to identify them, and to get them to contribute small contributions over and over again in many cases to fund that campaign.
Let's go back to 2016, to the election. On the Wikipedia page, there's a lot of green, there's a lot of yellow of Hillary and Bernie. Were there moments in that campaign, Tad, where Bernie really did have a good chance of winning the nomination?
I do think he had a chance, a real chance. And it was at the beginning, mostly, a little bit after that. This was the chance that he had. And I talk about this in the book. I was asked by Bernie and his wife, Jane, to travel to Burlington, Vermont and spend a weekend with them in the middle of April 2015. We knew each other. We'd worked together on 2 winning campaigns for House and Senate. And they knew that I had this background and experience at very high levels of presidential campaigns. And I was the only one really in their group that had it. And I spent that weekend with them talking to him about the likelihood of success, how to put together a campaign, what are all the elements of it that would be involved. And I pushed him very hard. Bernie and I knew each other pretty well, and we could be tough on each other, particularly when we were just the two of us together. And I explained the whole system of delegate selection in the Democratic Party. I spent a decade in the 80s working for Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, and Michael Dukakis, working my way through the ranks of delegate selection, from a tracker to the deputy director to the director of delegate selection and the floor manager at a convention. And so I knew this system from a decade's worth of experience. And when I explained it to him in terms of the super delegates, of which 40% of the nominating majority was super delegates, proportional representation, something I had worked on, an allocation of delegate formula, all of the sort of inside workings of the party. And I said, listen, this system is set up to make it almost impossible. And in order for you to win, first we're going to have to win Iowa, then we'll have to win New Hampshire, then we'll have to win Nevada. Somehow we'll have to figure out how we're going to beat her in South Carolina. And when that happens, we'll face the second front from the entire establishment. That's what we're confronting. And I really pushed him on, why are you doing this? Because I'm telling you, as someone who's done this for a decade and is recognized as knowing as much or more about it than anybody, you can't win in this system. And he explained to me in very colorful language, which I'm not going to repeat here, that he was sick and tired of being a backbencher. Okay. And that really was the moment when I understood the motivation of the candidate, what the campaign was about. Now, as we got into this, and to answer more directly your question, was there a time when we thought we could win? I think that in the aftermath of his performance in the New Hampshire primary, he won the New Hampshire primary by 22 points against Hillary Clinton, who had beaten Obama in New Hampshire 8 years before. Okay. and he received 150,000 votes. That was a number, if people like me who worked a lot in New Hampshire over the years, I never thought anybody would get to 150,000 votes in a contested primary when both parties are holding primaries on the same day. Because when that happens, as it did in New Hampshire and other states like Michigan and Wisconsin later on, where the state is holding a primary, where there is party registration, and where independents can participate in either the Democratic or the Republican primary, it becomes a real, true test of general election strength. And when Bernie went out and won that 150,000 votes in New Hampshire that night of the primary, its 100th anniversary of the primary, I think we all thought, wait a second, we may be riding the rocket here. Okay, this is, and I've been on the other side of that too. I was in New Hampshire in 1984 when Gary Hart beat Walter Mondale. I was working for Mondale. I said I was part of the establishment before. Those are the candidates typically that I work for. And I saw how that momentum can build so quickly in so many places based on victory. So coming out of, New Hampshire, I think we all thought, listen, maybe we can do this thing. Now, in order to do it, we're going to have to go and win Nevada. We were 25 points behind in Nevada just a couple before New Hampshire. I know that because not only did we poll there, but also Clinton put out their polling as well. And what they put out was a 25-point Hillary lead. And as we went to Nevada and began to close that gap of 25 points and really run it down, we saw the possibility of victory there. And I think that victory for us was turned into defeat by the actions again of the Democratic establishment. And I write about it in the book. Harry Reid, who at the time was alive and still controlled the politics of that state, particularly Democratic politics, intervened on behalf of Hillary, and I think made the difference. And it's not just my opinion either, by the way. I write about John Ralston, who's probably the most astute observer of Nevada politics, who wrote an open column in USA Today a week after that primary where he exposed Harry Reid's involvement, and he said he did it because he and the establishment knew that if Bernie won that primary, the whole inevitability message, which was the heart of their messaging, would have been destroyed, and she may have lost.
Tad, outsiders have, of course, stormed the party before. Think of Hillary Clinton's husband, Bill, Jimmy Carter. What was it, or what is it about Bernie? Is it because people fear this socialist, this democratic socialist, the man of the left? Or is it because he just doesn't play the game of the Democrats? What triggered the behavior of Harry Reid, who I assume in other contexts is a relatively honorable figure?
He was an honorary figure, and I liked Harry Reid.
Honorable rather than honorary. I mean, a decent enough guy.
I respected Harry Reid. I liked Harry Reid. Harry Reid was a good man, okay, in many ways. But what happened, okay, in Nevada. And why did people feel this way about Bernie? I think part of it was, the Democratic Socialist thing was something, but I don't think that was a huge impediment. I really don't. And, I pushed him very hard in the campaign to give the speech about what Democratic Socialism meant to him. He did so. And I think it was very refreshing when he did, because what we found out from that speech was that the Democratic Socialism of Bernie Sanders had uniquely American origins. He, in fact, wanted to accomplish what Franklin Roosevelt left as his unfinished agenda. Roosevelt proposed a second Bill of Rights for workers before he died. And Bernie wanted us to be the ones to pick that up and to run with it and to realize it in our time. And, so to me, it wasn't some foreign ideology inspired by Europe or some faraway place. It was very much an American political movement that Martin Luther King, who used to talk about, socialism for the rich and rugged capitalism for the poor, understood as well. So I think people were scared about the socialist stuff. I think, in terms of Bernie not being a guy who would compromise, I think his rhetoric put off some people in the party, and certainly the vested and powerful, wealthy interests of the party didn't like what he was talking about in terms of the money polluting everything. But I think, the people who dealt with him in a legislative environment understood that he was a practical politician. The people who dealt with him when he was mayor of Burlington understood that he was a very practical politician who was willing to work with the interests of his community or in the broader political interests in Washington to find common ground and to achieve real results. So listen, I think his style put him off. I think the label put people off. But who he didn't put off in 2016 were the voters. Okay, the voters heard his message, and when they heard it, they acted. And I think if the process had been level and fair, he would have been the nominee, and he would have defeated Trump in the general election.
Yeah, and in a sense, I mean, of course, he didn't win, but he almost won by not winning, especially given Hillary's defeat by Clinton and everything, by Trump and everything that's happened since. Tad, I'm sure you've seen the movie Chinatown. At the end of the movie, there's that famous phrase, "It's just Chinatown." Could we remix that and say, well, this is just politics? I mean, you're not happy about Harry Reid in Nevada, but that was his home state. He did everything he could to support his candidate, and that's just the way things work. Why is that? Why is that the Democrats screwing Bernie? It's just the nature of politics.
Well, I think the Democrats screwing Bernie about a lot of things, not just Harry Reid doing something that he said he wasn't going to do. And by the way, I remember sitting in Nevada and elsewhere with Bernie being on the phone with his leader in the Senate, and and it was very cordial, and it was a very good relationship. And he said he was neutral. It turned out later, we found out that that was not true. It was really what happened inside the campaign, and there were some prominent examples. So, for example, in December of 2015, the campaign is moving. We went on television in November. Hillary went on in August. So they had 3 months of unanswered TV in Iowa and New Hampshire. We weren't even on. We joined in November, and you could see, and everybody was picking it up in their polling, the movement towards Bernie. First, within the internal numbers of the poll, his favorability skyrocketing, his unfavorability staying low. Then we began to see the results in the horse race. So now we get to the middle of December, and suddenly the Democratic National Committee comes forward out of nowhere and says that our campaign did something very wrong, that we spied on the voter files. These voter files are very precious tools for a campaign. They give each campaign the identity of every voter in each individual state and allow us to target them for communication and to figure out who would be with us. And in our case, uniquely, much more so than the Clintons, it provided the base upon which we did our fundraising. That was the email list were going out under the auspices of the voter files. And, when they decided that we had done something wrong, that we had violated the rules by looking, at the Clinton voter files, because these voter files are available to each campaign, but there are firewalls that are built up. So one campaign can't look on the other campaign's files. When the firewall came down because of the negligence of the people who were in charge of it, and a few young people in our campaign went and looked for a half hour at the voter files, they stood up and said, "We're taking your voter files away." Now, in my mind, it was clear what they were doing. It was clear that they were rigging the process, that we were moving too fast. They wanted to stop us. And we had to go to federal court that night and prevail there in order to get our hands back on the voter files. It was the debate process. In 8 years earlier, when Obama and Hillary were running against each other, there were numerous debates, and the Republicans had numerous debates. The Democratic National Committee announced that before, this is it, and if you don't take our schedule, you can't come to any of the 4 debates, okay? One of the debates was on the Saturday night before Christmas. I mean, it was a ridiculous thing. And I knew I got a call about 15 minutes. I didn't write about this in the book, but this is what happened. I got a call about 15 minutes before the public announcement that this was going to go on. And then about 10 minutes later, after they announced it, Hillary Clinton tweeted that she accepted the invitation for debates. I mean, it was such an obvious fix. And there were so many things like that went on, within the Democratic National Committee, that finally, when this was all revealed, when the WikiLeaks, correspondence came out and thousands upon thousands of emails to the DNC between the Clinton campaign were exposed, we could see with our own eyes that the Clinton campaign effectively ran the Democratic National Committee, which was in charge of the process. And that's how Bernie got screwed. Yeah, Harry Reid in Nevada. Yes, the Democratic establishment in a lot of places, but mostly it was the coordination between the party apparatus and the Clinton campaign that distorted the rules, gave her undue advantage. And then finally, even though she said she would never do it, the super PACs, which they set up, again, in coordination with the Democratic Party, and raised astronomical amounts of money. They said they were for the general election, but when she started losing to Bernie, they started entering the primary process. So all of these factors came together to screw Bernie, not just one person like Harry Reid or one event like the voter files, but all of these things together gave Hillary an unfair advantage. And as a result, the voters didn't have their say in choosing a nominee.
Well, you've certainly convinced me. Tad, that the Democrats screwed Bernie. 10 years later, the struggle, at least according to Bernie Sanders' X account, the struggle continues. You've mentioned Mandami. As we speak, there's a huge scandal, a controversy over Graham Plattner, again in New England, another controversial Democratic politician. What have we learned in the last 10 years? Has anything changed since, in your words, the Democrats screwed Bernie, as the Dems are preparing for another round in 2028? And mainstream Democrats like Gavin Newsom, Kamala Harris are going to go up against one kind of insurgent or another?
Well, some things have changed. I mean, Bernie fought very hard in the wake of the 2016 to take away the voting status of the superdelegates on the first round of ballots. But aside from that, frankly, not a lot has changed. To be honest with you, I think I'm not accusing the Democratic National Committee now of being partisan and for a candidate. I think the situation we had in 2016 with Hillary Clinton, I mean, she was almost in effect an incumbent president running for re-election. She had so much support from the entire establishment. We don't have anybody in those ranks, and I think the party will be much more of a neutral party today than it was in 2016. But there still are many, many things that we have to change if we want to get where we need to be. I mean, and in terms of Plattner, just because you raised it, I mean, I do, and I do think I just saw in one of my email notes before we started this conversation that Bernie has called for him to drop out, as many others have. The mayor did earlier in the day as well, and I think that's the right decision. Sometimes in campaigns, candidates have to realize that they simply cannot succeed. Okay, and if they want the change that they're calling for, it's going to have to be somebody else who carries the mantle of change.
Is Bernie, he has a very active X account. He's got almost 15 million followers. He's active on the Gaza issue. He's active on tech. Has he become a king or queen maker in the party? Is that his victory, really, out of 2016, out of defeat? He's become perhaps certainly the most respected elder statesman. I mean, I don't think Hillary has a lot of credibility. She might think she has, but I don't think anyone outside her own little circle thinks she has, as well as Kamala, who seems to be Hillary, a sort of a second coming of Hillary in some ways.
I think he has become one of the most important leaders in the Democratic Party, even though he's not part of it. He's never really identified as a Democrat. Unlike Mandami, who said, yes, I'm the Democratic nominee, he sort of embraced it. But I think Bernie's contribution that is much more important than his status as someone who can help people to win elections, okay, which is a pretty powerful thing, as the mayor demonstrated in the most recent primaries here in New York. His biggest contribution, I think, is substantive, that he has identified the problem in our society, the biggest problem in our society. All of us who are against Donald Trump sort of see him as the problem, but really the problem is that America's economy is rigged, and that rigged economy is held in place by a corrupt system of campaign finance. That was the problem that I think the campaign in 2016 identified. I remember as we were trying to find the way to best express that, Bernie at first didn't want to have any polling. And I was like, I really need polling to do my job. My job is not just, sort of writing ads and things like that. My job is to find out who the targets are. And then the media buy is targeting towards people who we can persuade. And you only know that if you have research. And I needed this in order to do my job. And finally, he yielded and let us go in there. And when we were testing, Ben Tolchin, who's in California, pollster, a very good national pollster, and I, we're talking through the poll, and we had an argument about the economy being rigged, and we had an argument about a corrupt system of campaign finance. Usually when we're testing these arguments in polling, they come in the form of narrative descriptive paragraphs where you describe something in about 30 seconds, the length of an ad, and then you get feedback from it. And I suggested to Ben that we combine these two messages, and it came out to a sentence, which is America has a rigged economy held in place by a corrupt system of campaign finance. And when we first and finally polled in Iowa and New Hampshire, that frame of messaging was the highest testing message in both states. So we knew finally where the sweet spot was with the voters, what they were looking for in that election. And when Bernie delivered it, that's when his campaign began to move. And I believe that is his biggest contribution to the debate today, that he understands the problem that is holding back our economy, crushing the middle class, making it impossible for people to afford groceries, gas, and healthcare. It's really the system that is holding it back. And until we correct that, we're not going to be able to have a thriving middle class again in America.
Well, you mentioned earlier that Trump and Sanders exist in kind of parallel. Hasn't that message been, for better or worse, appropriated by the MAGA crowd? Aren't the people, many of the victims of this Brave New World, aren't they voting for Trump and right-wing populism?
They are, and I write about it in the book, the comparison between the two populists, the phony populist, Trump, who came in and grabbed this stuff and ran with it, and a real populist like Bernie, who actually is dedicated to improving the lives of people. Trump's populism was also, infused with his xenophobia, with his racism, with all of the bad aspects that he brings to politics, including being, as Bernie first described him, a pathological liar. Okay, all of these things are in the bundle for Trump. I think what Bernie represents is a belief that government has a role of serving people, not a role of telling people what to do in their lives and making rich people even richer, which is the current state of government in America today.
Finally, Bernie won't run in 2028, but of course, AOC might. She's toured with Bernie. She seems to be the younger female face in some ways of Sanderism, if there's such a thing. Will there, in your view, Tad, you're a keen political observer, you still have your own political consultancy. Is it fairly inevitable that there will be a Bernie-style serious candidate in the Democratic race in 2028?
I think there probably will be one or more. Yes, I think a lot of people are going to run for president in 2028 because they can sense, the frustration underneath the surface of the Democratic Party, that people are desperate for new leadership and a new way forward. And so I don't know if it's going to be, AOC or Khanna, who is very much someone who supported Bernie and shares many of the same principles as he does, and belief in issues like Medicare for all, for example. And I think others could come forward. We're seeing, remember, at this point in the calendar, going into 2006, Barack Obama was a state senator from Illinois. There are still people out there who may only come into focus after the next midterm, who, if they're in the right place at the right time, can springboard, in our society today. We have so many ways of communicating with people and so many ways of raising money, that in fact, I think a lot of people who we don't even know right now could become potentially the nominee of the Democratic Party.
Well, it's all rather encouraging, Tad, I think. The Democrats, as you note, screwed Bernie, but you seem to be suggesting that American democracy is surviving with or without Trump. He certainly hasn't helped. But what's your sense, your optimism or pessimism about American democracy in 2028? Will there be a fair election?
I don't know. And I can't describe myself as totally optimistic about it. I am very hopeful that we will prevail, that we will have free and fair elections here in our nation. And boy, if you asked me this question 30 years ago, when I first started working outside the United States and came into contact with systems that are very different than ours, I never would have believed that our country would be where it is today, with an authoritarian president, with a complicit press in many ways supporting him, and with a threat to the actual freedom of elections itself sitting there in the White House. And so I think we all have to recognize that this threat is real and that this president is capable of doing anything. We already saw it on January 6th, what he did, and he is capable of doing that and worse again. So we'll be tested. I'm hoping that if we win elections, and this is the only way to fix the problem, people have to run on this message, okay, and have to win. And when people run and win on a message that this economy is rigged and that the rigging of it is because of the system of campaign finance, then the others will back down. It's the only way to make them back down. You have to beat them in elections. And I hope we start this November.
Well, that's the Bernie message. The Democrats did screw Bernie, but I wouldn't say Bernie screwed them back, but he certainly is more powerful in many ways than the whole Democratic establishment put together. Tad Devine, the book came out yesterday, How the Democrats Screwed Bernie. Congratulations. It's an important book, important message. And as the 2028 Democratic race unfolds, I'd love to get you back on the show. Thank you so much.
Great, Andrew. Great to be with you.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.